Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. We are here today doing one of our People and Projects episode. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi Country with the very fabulous Alexa Delbosc from Monash University. Perhaps, Alexa, you would like to introduce yourself. Are you a professor, an associate professor, or a doctor?
Associate professor.
What's the difference between a professor, associate professor, and a doctor?
Oh, look, I like to say I associate with professors, but I am not yet one, technically. It's just an academic ranking. You start out as a doctor and you work your way up. That's all.
If you were in a military setting, it would be moving up in the ranks there.
I like to think so. That sounds fantastic.
So you're at Monash University. What's your area of research and what made you interested in that? And you don't sound like you were raised here, so perhaps you were raised somewhere else, and what made you want to come to Australia and what you do and research what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, which is Wurundjeri country, but not the place I was born. As you picked up, I was born in the United States, in Oregon on the West Coast. And I met an Australian boy, and that brought me down to Australia almost 20 years ago now. So been here a while, but in that journey, I actually studied psychology, social psychology, understanding people, what makes us tick, what makes us do what we do. Almost by accident fell into transport, applying that thirst for understanding why people make the decisions they do when they travel and how they travel, and teach traffic engineering as well. So I've got that side to me, and here I am today.
I have a psychology degree as well. What is your area in psychology that you were most interested? Was it behavioral learning, or what was that?
Social psychology, behavioral psychology, egocentrism, anthropomorphism, all kinds of isms that, believe it or not, I managed to figure out ways to apply some of those to the transport system even today. I did like to say when I was studying it and people said, oh, psychology, ooh, are you going to analyze me? I'd say, look, I'm not the kind of psychologist that wants to help people. I like to do experiments on people, understand what they do.
I do have that background where I can analyze people, and my line is always that, well, that's what we're doing all the time. Yeah, so I've got a few extra skills, but hey, everyone's got a few extra skills. I certainly can't read your mind. I met you because you were posting some things on LinkedIn, and I think you mentioned something about a study with Lime scooters and with low-income communities and how a particular program that they implemented. Perhaps you could introduce all that.
Yeah, happy to. Most of the operators of shared e-bike and e-scooter programs in Australia offer a discount for people who have maybe, say, a concession card, a low-income card. It's not very well known, but it does exist, this program, to help people who might not have other means to get around. They might not be able to afford their own car, a more inexpensive way to use bikes and scooters in generally cities where they're operating and some small towns around Australia. What we found from this study is that the folks accessing bikes and e-scooters through the discount, they tended to use the system in very useful ways. They used them more often. They used them to get to the shops, to get to work, not just out for fun of an evening, and they're not just tourists, for example. So it was a very different demographic, a very different use case to what a lot of people seem to think scooters in particular are for, that they're just for young kids going out for drinks at the end of the day or for tourists to their town or city.
That would completely reflect what I see here in Caboolture. We have a really huge diversity of income capacities and educational levels. So some people are quite wealthy, big houses, and then you have a lot of people who have maybe come through poverty. People are desperate to have these kinds of programs. Are those Lime scooters, is that something that people in our community, so if our listener is somebody on a low income, that could they get access to that, or is that something the council has to implement? How does it work?
First, you'd need to have one of these shared programs available in your town. Do you have any shared bikes or shared scooter programs? No, yeah.
No. And how would we maybe get one, do you think?
In Australia, it's a bit different. In the US, they kind of just land in a city and say, hey, here we are. Anyone can rent us now. In Australia, we have a lot more regulations around new vehicles. I mean, when e-scooters first landed, they were a completely new kind of vehicle. Well, how do we even classify them? Do we classify them as a bike or a moped or a Vespa? So there's a lot more controls over where they're allowed to operate. And that's up to local councils to decide whether they want to allow one of these private operators to run a program in their council. So it's very hodgepodge. Even in the big cities, like in Adelaide, for example, they're allowed to operate shared scooters in the very center of the city, in the CBD, and then along the waterfront, but nowhere else in between. So you can't ride them between the council areas, for example. But there are some suburbs here and there that just have gone, yep, we want to try them out here. So you're welcome to come and set up shop. And here are the rules around how you're allowed to operate. But it's just a matter of allowing that to happen and setting up an agreement with the operators. Once that's done, the operators choose whether or not to offer a discount program. And so far, most of them do, but that's left to the operators rather than the council to say, no, if you're going to operate here, you have to have a program like this.
Get Around was approached to consult on a policy for e-scooters last year. And I bumped into the person who held that consultation. And she said, oh, I think they didn't have any funding. They did the consultation thing and I was going, this is great. And then they didn't go ahead with it. There is some negativity around scooters, e-scooters, e-bikes. I met a fellow yesterday in the shopping centre and he said, I don't want to be on the footpath. I want to be in my own lane. Bike riders have historically said the same thing. We don't want to be on the footpath, but we don't have anywhere else. And, so many of us are required to fit within 1.2 meters. There's like pedestrians, mobility scooters, wheelchairs, e-scooters, scooters, bikes, and we're all squished into this space because cars take up maybe 1 or 2 lanes and then they park in the road-related area. That's the frustration, is actually cars are so greedy with land space that nobody else gets a bit of a heads up. So there are some problems with e-scooters and e-bikes, and perhaps you could speak to some of that contentious side of things.
Oh yeah. I mean, the road and footpath has always been a contended space, right? There's never enough space. Everybody has a reason to want more. Generally, if you drive a car, you want more space for that car to park it and drive it. And if you don't or can't drive a car, you're fighting over the scraps that are left over. And we know if you do provide safe bike infrastructure, e-scooters are much more likely to use it than to ride on the footpath. As you say, they don't want to have to mix with pedestrians and worry about running into someone. If you build it, people will come and will use it. It might not be full the way a car lane is full, but cars are huge. Car lanes are full because you've got a huge vehicle moving a small person. Whereas bikes and scooters are so tiny, yes, of course the lane is empty most of the time because they can just glide along and off they go. And in suburban areas, outer areas like Caboolture, that middle distance mode is so important, right? Cars are great for long distance travel. Public transport is great for long distance travel if you've got it. But in outer suburban areas, you might not have it, or it might be a kilometer away to get to it, right? And walking can only get you so far unless you're really fit and really committed. Where bikes and e-scooters fill that middle distance, especially in suburban areas where it might take a while to get to the nearest train or bus station, and how much quicker you can do that if you're on a bike or a scooter.
How do you see that we could perhaps encourage our council to take up scooters? Because basically what's happened now is that people are just buying their own because the council is actually not providing it, and they're creating this problem in a way. What's been your experience when bikes and scooters and shared programs have been implemented in outer suburban areas? What sort of problems have they come up against with the councils or state? Has there been conflict there? How does it work?
Well, from the operator's perspective, it is harder for them to go into more outer suburban areas or small towns because there's not as much demand. They're a company, they have to pay their bills, and if there is not as many people as there would be in downtown Brisbane hopping on their scooters all day, they might start out there and then have to stop running the program if they can't make enough money back. You could argue, depending on how they're used and who's using them, that is it that much different to the way we subsidize buses and trains? They don't make money either, but we still run them even in suburban areas because they're needed by the community. So there could be an argument that if this is another way to help the community get around for people who can't afford to buy their own scooter or bike, is it worth thinking about?
Actually, we heavily subsidize cars as well. People tell me, oh yes, but buses don't run at a profit. I'm going, well, neither do cars. Cars are terrible. They're like throwing good money after bad that cause so much pain for everybody. They cost a lot on kind of every measure.
In the places where you have both shared scooters and privately owned scooters, the market for the privately owned scooters does slowly grow. People might try it out through an operator and go, oh, this is quite fun. I like being able to zip along without being sweaty when I get to where I'm going. I like to be able to wear what I want and stand upright instead of worry about bicycle spokes, for example. If it works out for them, they go, you know what, I'm just going to get my own and I'm going to use this more often and I'm going to use it in different ways. Just anecdotally, I see them used in so many ways that I think, oh, wouldn't have thought of that. I've seen tradies who throw them in the back of the ute. Maybe they can't park right at the work site, so they have to park a block away, hop on the scooter, off they go. At the end of the day, back to the truck. The other day, I was in the shopping center getting my son a haircut in the cheapest haircut place in the shopping center, and there were two e-scooters tucked behind the hairstylists. They clearly would ride their scooters to work. There's a group of people that love riding them, and it really works for them.
As you were speaking and you were saying it would be difficult to get them subsidized, what if, for instance, an e-scooter, e-bike company, we have a Caboolture neighborhood center, so people who are low incomes, you actually hire a space in there and then anybody can use it, but obviously it's super convenient for the people who need it. And you could do the same in schools, you could do the same in all sorts of different targeted venues. It's not just for the people using from those places like schools. You could do it at the hospital, you could do it in very targeted areas. Has that been something that you've tried or thought about? And if so, what's been the impact?
Yeah, not me personally, but there are programs around, generally in the US are the ones I'm familiar with, where they set up kind of like lending libraries of bikes and scooters. People can check out or borrow for a certain amount of time to just try it out. For e-bikes, for example, a little bit of a diversion from shared, but even just having a bike with a motor can be just life-changing for some people and some families, because suddenly you can carry cargo, you can carry your kids on the back, you can go uphill, you can go in the heat. The battery is just enough oomph to keep you going and getting you the other end without being too tired or too sweaty. There are families where it replaces the second car. We don't need a second car anymore because I'll just ride the kids to work. But they're expensive. You know, it's at least $1,000. I think the cheapest one at Aldi is $1,000. So having a lending library, for example, lets people try it out for a while and go, is this going to be worth the investment for me? A $2,000 bike sounds like a lot, but if it's replacing an old Holden, it's going to save your family a lot in the long term.
Yes, so a couple of things about that. There is a company, they offer loans for e-bikes. I have an e-bike. I bought it when I moved up here because I didn't want to have a car. We don't have a car. And I have a cargo e-bike. It's a big red thing with a box at the front and box at the back. And I just go everywhere with it. It is fantastic. I love it. And we recently had Phil Latz. He's been in the cycling world since 1972. And he cited a study which showed Choice Magazine had done it. When you buy a bike from one of the big box stores, a supermarket, whatever, or you buy a bike from one of the proper bike stores, and they had done a study on the financial costs. After 6 months, the supermarket one, the big box store, big chains that we all know, becomes more expensive than the one that you buy at the bike store. Because as a friend of mine the other day said, oh, my daughter got one from a supermarket. I must take it down to the bike shop because it doesn't quite fit right. The gears don't quite work properly and I need to get these extra things on it, kind of false economy. So I think that, short-term hire is a great thing because it makes people do that transition, maybe save a little bit of money to get a proper bike, maybe get a loan through one of these companies.
Again, anecdotally, we bought my son his first bike at Christmas this year from a big box, out of a box, and we thought, oh, we'll just put it together at home. How hard can it be? Oh my goodness, caliper brakes are really complicated. And thank goodness I had a friend that knew what he was doing, because otherwise it was going to cost probably almost as much as the bike was worth for me to take it to a bike shop to set it up properly. I went, learn that lesson. Whew.
This is the deal. This is how it is across the board. But I understand, we think, I want to get a bike because I don't want to have the car. And then it doesn't work. And then they go, look, I'll just go back to having a car. The bike doesn't work. It also stops that one. So you're an academic, you're a researcher. What projects are you working on currently?
I am doing a lot more work in the space of understanding e-scooters, who's using them and why and how can we better integrate them into our towns and cities and suburbs. They've got a bad reputation. A lot of people really hate e-scooters. Part of it, I think, is just because they're new, they're unfamiliar, and yes, sometimes people ride them irresponsibly. They ride them on the footpath too fast, or they spook you as you're walking along, right? And occasionally they knock people over. It's not good that it happens. It's not good at all. But you're far more likely to get knocked over and seriously injured or killed by a car than you are by an e-scooter or a bike, because people have similar concerns about bikes. And the more people that are riding e-scooters and wanting better infrastructure, the more people we have out there saying we want bike lanes, we want to feel safe riding, whether it's on a scooter or a Segway or a bicycle or anything, right? Some of the work that we're doing there is trying to get a better understanding of how they're used in small towns. A lot of the work is out of the capital cities, and small towns, they kind of just say, oh, they're just for tourists. So there's a lot of small towns in Geraldton, Albany, those kinds of places that have shared bike or shared scooter programs, and not a lot of interest in looking at it because they just kind of go, oh, it's just for out of town people. But is it? We don't know. That's a really big assumption to make. There's some early work. A colleague of mine, Jeff Rose, here at Monash University, did some work in Hobart and found that the use of the shared scooters skyrocketed right when the buses stopped running in Hobart. From about 8 o'clock onward, there are no buses, so everybody hops on the scooters. So again, they're filling a gap in our transport system. That's one of the areas I want to learn more about.
Well, you can always come up here and do a study in Caboolture because we have a really bad bus service. The whole reason I started Get Around was because I got on the bus. It's a 10-minute drive from Caboolture down to Morayfield Shopping Centre. You go along King Street and then you go down Morayfield Road. These are the two main streets in this area. And it took me 40 minutes. And I wanted to get right to the other end of Morayfield Road to buy a helmet. And it would have required 2 buses and a 25-minute wait at Morayfield Shopping Centre. And that would have been an hour and a half. It was actually quicker to walk, according to Google, than it was to get the bus. I just went, this is completely unworkable. I wanted to get a bike helmet. And in the end, I bought it online because it was just easier. And that's a loss for the community because I would have happily bought it here in the local community, had a local person employed, but I couldn't do it because the bus service didn't function. In places where there is a really poor service, scooters and bikes are absolutely the game changer because, a lot of people don't drive. What do you see are the official stats for people who can't drive straight up, just don't have a license? Have you seen the stats on that?
I did a lot of work on driver licensing earlier in my career. What would it be at the moment? In Victoria, it was something like 8% of adults age, mid-30s and older didn't have a license. That's higher the younger you get compared to 10, 20 years ago. Young people take longer. I'm not going to say everywhere. There's some places where if you want to get around, the first thing you do is get your own driver's license because you don't have other options except relying on your parents. There had been a bit of a generational change that on average, young people were taking longer to get their driver's license and living without a car for longer into their young adulthood. In most parts of Australia, get to a stage where if you want to be able to get around easily, the easiest way to do that is with a car license. That's a very long answer to your very short question. Do you know in your community in Caboolture?
I didn't know what it was for the unlicensed. We would have quite a low number of people who are unlicensed, relatively speaking, because it's so bad. It's just people come from overseas and the first thing they do is they go, I've got to get a driver's license. So that is absolutely true. Kids, the terrible drop off to school, which so many parents are burdened with. If you could get the kids riding and walking to school, wouldn't that make a difference? You would just remove a good amount of that traffic. So anybody under 17, only those who are wealthy enough to drive get the opportunity to own a car and get a license, because I gather now it's quite expensive. And then you have a whole lot of people who are in their senior years. I'm increasingly coming across a number of people who don't want to drive because they just feel it's so aggressive on the road. And I don't know whether it is more aggressive now, driving styles, or whether that's a perception, or whether that's because the vehicles are so much bigger that the perception is that it's a scarier space. Have you looked at any research into that? Seen any?
It's really hard to pin down, but I think there's a sense in road safety since COVID, the driving behaviors have worsened. That we had, at least in Victoria, we'd gotten pretty good with enforcement that if you were drink driving or drug driving, you knew you had to be careful because you might get pulled over and caught and lose your license. But there seems to be more aggressive driving, speeding, drug driving than there was before COVID. Nobody's quite sure why. If it's that they had, a year or two of no enforcement because nobody was going anywhere, or I don't know what it is, but it's becoming a real problem. Certainly vehicle size makes you feel safer if you're inside those big vehicles, which is why people buy them. But they're less safe for the people outside the vehicle, especially for pedestrians, cyclists, and especially for children. It's just harder to see them, these massive and growing vehicles.
Yeah, so KidsSafe in Queensland have a little fact sheet, and they said an average of 3 children a week are driven over by their own parents in their own car, in their own driveway. It's more likely to be boys because they tend to be more boisterous and rush out. There's definitely truth to that. And the bonnet size, so I looked at some stats of a car, one of those big cars. Somebody had one nearby. The actual chassis size was 2 meters at the front and then 5 meters length. And then when I did the bonnet height, it was 1 meter 40. So I looked up an 8-year-old child and it's about 127 centimeters. And then we have these 50-kilometer-an-hour speeds. The stopping distance for 50 kilometers an hour speeds, I think, is 35 meters, whereas at 30 kilometers an hour, it's 12 meters, I believe. Have you done any research into speeds and why councils or the government is so reluctant to implement changing slower speeds at all?
Because the ownership of the speed limit, it depends on the state. In Victoria, at least, the default speed limit is set by the state government. It's not actually legislated. It's not like you have to change a law to change a default speed limit. In the 90s, I think it was, they changed the default in Victoria from 60, used to be 60 on neighborhood streets, to 50. But now to get it down to 40 or even 30, it's individual councils having to appeal to the state government and say, we want to do a trial. Always has to be a trial first. In these neighborhoods, may we please have permission? Okay. And then go do the trial and monitor it and say, these are the outcomes. Can we make it permanent? Okay. So it's a huge undertaking and it puts all of those resource and time burden on the local councils that have much less of that resources than state government. And some councils just don't have the time and resources to do it, even if they wanted to. Unfortunately, a lot of barriers. There has been a lot of change over the last few decades of individual neighborhoods and councils saying, we want change here, we want change here, we want change here. I hear in WA, it's the Road Safety Commissioner owns the speed limit. And there's a lot more of a push as well there for in built up areas in towns to reduce the default to 40, which still isn't the world standard. The world standard is 30, but at least in Victoria, they say that's not one of our speed limits. It's just not in the books. We have an official speed limit at 10, 20, 40, 50, 60, still 70, yeah, 80. I think they got rid of 90 and then 100, 110, 120, but 30 is not a number in our books. It's like insanity. Like, so put it in the books.
So New South Wales has just done that. I think Transport for New South Wales now has 30 kilometres an hour. So it can be done. We just need to get it done.
The best part about reducing your default speed limit on neighborhood streets to 30 kilometers an hour, so many of us, it's practically free. Once you've said this is the change to the law, you'll need some new signage, you'll need campaigns, you'll need enforcement compared to adding footpath, adding bike paths. The cost-benefit ratio, enormous benefits. You save lives for almost no cost. In one change of that law, you massively increase your bike network, your safe bike network or scooting network, whatever. Research has shown that if the speed limit is 30 kilometers an hour or lower, and it's enforced, so people are actually following it, people feel so much more safe and comfortable riding on the roads with their kids, with their granny, that you don't need a bike lane. And huge proportions of your neighborhoods now are safe zones, are safe places that you can trust that if your kid rides their bike to school, they'll make it there safely.
The other thing, I was talking with Rod King from 20's Plenty, which is, so it's 20 miles an hour, the equivalent of 30 kilometers an hour here. He was saying that the other part of it is that when you're in your home, actually it's quieter. It's quieter in their garden. It's quieter in the streets. So you can use the space better. Your house value increases. Your quality of life increases. And it takes hardly any time difference because suburban streets aren't huge thoroughfares, or they shouldn't be. And if they are, they need to not be. Needs a bit of redesign on those ones. When you do that, actually the speed, you don't lose as much time as you think you do, because as soon as you come up to a junction or a cross street or a parked car or anything, you have to slow down anyway. It's not like you're doing a huge long distance. You're just going half a kilometer, not even 200 meters most of the time before you have to slow down for an intersection. So you don't lose any time really.
When you do polling about this, people tend to want it in their neighborhood, right? Because nobody likes other people driving fast on their street. But if you say, oh, what if we changed it everywhere? And then they're like, oh, I don't know about that. Because like I do cut down those streets on my commute to avoid the traffic, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, because that's somebody else's street where they're living and their kids. So there's a little funny dichotomy there.
I used to be a terrible aggressive driver and always using the rat runs. And I get it because I have that efficiency style about me, which is always like, but I could avoid that traffic light. The idea of sitting at a traffic light makes my blood boil. And so I get it. I get that that's a problem. Now I'm old and boring and middle-aged. So what I like to ask is, what do you recommend that our listener could do to implement today, so tomorrow, this weekend, that is in line with making our streets better, safer, for everybody to use?
I think the number one thing you can do is to write to your council and ask for lower speed limits in your neighborhood. To say there's lots of studies you could point your listeners to, where they could just take it off the shelf and say they did it in this neighborhood and it saved lives. They did it in this neighborhood and it slowed people down. And just why don't we have it in our neighborhood? Because the more people that ask the question, the more the council will go, oh, maybe some people do want this. Oh, maybe more people do want this, instead of just saying, oh, yeah, okay, one person. Yeah, okay. I get it. You don't want people speeding on your street, but otherwise we'll add a speed hump and we'll move on. Because that's how a lot of the change happens. It comes from the communities. It comes from things like 20s plenty, 30s plenty coming together and saying, in our community, this is what we want. And what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, not everybody is able to write a letter. So, what can a listener do?
What else can a listener do? I do suggest, if they're hearing it from more than one voice. So, if we are talking about your listeners, if any of them out there haven't done that yet, just shooting an email. If there's ever a drop-in session, if they ever do reach out to the community, say, oh, we might be doing something in your neighborhood on X, hearing it from multiple voices one day could add up. Working with schools sometimes can be effective if you can get your school community to understand the benefits of reducing the speed limits around a school, changing the infrastructure around the school. Then you've got more voices together.
Have you ever had any success with putting in bike infrastructure and low speeds? And how do you get access to, do you start with a P&C or do you contact the school directly? What would be a way that our listener what would be the first thing?
For schools, it would definitely be within your school, getting your school community, whether it's a school council, class reps, that kind of thing. And a good time to do that is when the school community is getting more and more annoyed by parking or traffic problems. Because what that tends to be is, oh, the parking around the school is so bad because it's so busy in the morning. The council needs to fix it by giving us more parking. Well, do they? Is that the best way to solve that problem? Or would you rather have a different future where your kids can feel safe walking to school so you don't have to fight for a parking space? And that can be the moment where if you can get the school community on board to like, oh, wow, actually this version of the future could be better for us and our kids, then I think you've got a chance.
That's great advice. Thank you very much. The other thing I think is if you can buy a bike, that's great. And by the way, if you don't know how to ride a bike, I am more than happy to show you how to ride a bike. So our listener can contact us through the Facebook group or through our website. And I will happily just come and meet you and we can meet up for a few sessions and I will happily teach you how to ride a bike.
Does Caboolture have any places where people can drop in to get a bit of bike maintenance? My council here ran a couple hours drop-in session where if you've got a flat tire, we'll fix it for you. Anything like that?
Somebody in our community, one of the people who comes along for our slow ride, he actually does fix bikes and I could see if he could do it, because what I want to do is I want to start picnic bench conversations. So you have kitchen table conversations. We've got a park, it's just been refurbed and it looks beautiful and they have these beautiful park benches. And I thought, let's see if we can get a bit of a high doing a few things. One of them is conversations, and one of them, let's see if we can get bike maintenance and we can get our friend to do that.
That sounds great.
All right. Anything else you would like to add about your research or some ideas, or what else would you like to add?
If folks are on their social media, if that's how they get to you through LinkedIn, yeah, keep an eye out. That's where I tend to put my new stuff.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely. I'm trying really hard to get things so much better for us here in Caboolture. And it's people like you who do the research that provides the substantiation for being able to do it, because I rely so much on the research and what works, because I don't want some, bloke on YouTube to tell me what I should do, or a developer or a whatever. I want somebody who actually knows and studies this to give me the answer. And it's people like you that make that possible. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.